and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and today I have a special treat for you guys. I'm actually joined by a couple special guests. In the first place, I'm joined by the audience will remember Travis, the Skeptic, from back on our show on consciousness. How you doing, Travis?
Doing good. Good to be back. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. And the main event is we have this show is going to be on near-death experiences, and I've been lucky enough to get Dr. Bruce Greyson on.
Morning, Dale. Thank you for having me on Real Seekers.
I was definitely really excited to bring you on board. I've been a fan of your work ever since reading your old book, the Handbook of Near-Death Experiences. There, so yeah. All right, perfect. So just before we get into the actual topic for today, I just want to do a quick brief introduction with both the guests. So starting with you, Travis, just very quickly, out of curiosity, what have you been up to since you've last been on the show there?
Probably not a whole lot that would be of interest to anyone listening to the podcast. But if you want to look at, things that I've done in the past, there's a measureoffaith.blog is where I've put up some content, but I think the last post I had was when I was last on this podcast. So it's been pretty quiet.
All right, and turning to you, Bruce, why don't you take some time and just sort of introduce the audience as to who you are, what sort of interests you in getting involved with near-death experiences, and if you don't mind, maybe sort of give us a hint as to where you stand in terms of your religious stance and that sort of thing.
Sure. Well, I am a professor emeritus of psychiatry and neurobehavioral sciences at the University of Virginia School of Medicine. I've been there for the last quarter century or so, and I've actually been studying near-death experiences for about 45 years now. I'll tell you that I grew up in a scientific household where there was never the slightest bit of talk about anything spiritual or religious. It's not that we were anti-spiritual, it never occurred to us to talk about it. So I didn't grow up with any thoughts about God or religion or an afterlife, anything like that. When I started in medical school, I started coming across patients who had, of course, nearly died. Sometimes I resuscitated them myself, and I heard some fantastic stories from them. And I sort of dismissed them as delirious ramblings until I had enough of them so that they seemed to be consistent. I knew as a scientist I had to explore this. I couldn't just ignore it and pretend it wasn't happening. And over the last several years, several decades in fact, I've come to appreciate that these are very powerful, important experiences. And I've grown to appreciate our spiritual side. And I share this journey, my transformation in a sense, in my new book, which I call After.
Okay, all right, perfect. Yeah, I think with that said, let's get straight into the interview. Let's find out a little bit more about this. So yeah, Travis, did you want to ask the first question?
Well, sure. So obviously the first question to ask is, what is a near-death experience?
Right, the great question. We generally call near-death experiences NDEs, so we don't waste all our time talking about the near-death experience. NDEs are basically vivid, life-changing experiences that occur to many people when they're near death. Most of our data shows that it's about between 10 and 20% of people who come close to death have an NDE. They typically include things like an overwhelming sense of peace and well-being, a sense of leaving the physical body, meeting a being of light, having a review of your whole life, and sometimes seeing religious or deceased spirits. For me as a psychiatrist, the most important factor about them is that the after effects. They leave people with increased spirituality and compassion, decreased interest in status, competition, and material goods.
Just sort of following up on that then, so like with these near-death experiences or NDEs, what would you say are some of the main features of these things? And things, how do they relate to people's cultures or, religious beliefs or that sort of thing, or their, some of their other features like sex or mental illness?
Well, we have now looked at near-death experiences going back to ancient Greece and Rome and up to the present time, and in various cultures around the globe. And we find a number of common features that occur regardless of culture, age, gender, mental illness, and so forth. A few of these include the overwhelming sense of well-being and peace, a sense of leaving the physical body, encountering a living being of light, having your whole life flash before your eyes, sometimes seeing spirits which are sometimes identified as deceased loved ones and sometimes regarded as religious spirits, eventually coming to a point of no return where you are sent back or choose to come back. Now, of course, although these phenomena are seen around the world, how they're interpreted is influenced by our cultural background. For example, in the United States, many people who experience this warm, loving being of light will say that was God, whereas people from Hindu and Buddhist countries will not give it that label. Similarly, some people go through a long, dark tunnel before they get to another world. And in the United States, a lot of people call it a tunnel. In countries where there aren't structures like tunnels, they often will call it a cave. I had one truck driver I interviewed say he got sucked into a long tailpipe, and that was the way he described the tunnel. So your cultural background determines how you describe these things, but the things you're describing are the same from culture to culture. Now, for most people, this is an overwhelmingly positive and pleasant experience, but for a few people, we don't know how many, they're experienced as unpleasant. And I say we don't know how many because people are reluctant to talk about these unpleasant experiences.
Interesting. Do you have like a couple examples maybe of a distressing NDE?
Most often, it's a sense of complete nothingness, of being in a black void for eternity with no sights, no sounds, and that can be experienced as a terrifying thing for Westerners. Now, I will say I've talked to a few people who grew up in India who experienced this blank nothingness and experienced that as nirvana, as a blissful experience. So again, we have a basic phenomenon that is interpreted differently based on your background.
One thing that you mentioned there that I find interesting is the fact that these NDEs are very powerful experiences. They do transform people's life afterwards, right? They don't look at life the same way. I don't know if you wanted to maybe go into a little bit more detail on that and explain like how do these life changes actually relate to some of these similar features of the NDEs?
Sure. Let me give one example. Somebody I know quite well was a career Marine who was shot in Vietnam and had a bullet pierced through his lungs. And this guy was a tough macho. He had always been a schoolyard bully. And after his injury, during a surgical operation to remove the bullet, he had a profound near-death experience, left his body, encountered what he perceived as God and a deceased grandfather who sent him back. And when he returned, he found himself totally changed. He went back to the field because that was his life and found he could not shoot anymore. So he felt he was useless to the Marines. He eventually left and came back to the States and now works basically as a healthcare professional. And this is kind of typical of what you see after near-death experiences. People find that they have increased spirituality and compassion, decreased interest in competition, in material goods, in personal power or prestige or status. And you hear this time and time again. One person I knew was a drug addict who had a near-death experience when he overdosed on several drugs, mixture of drugs, and had a respiratory arrest. And after this experience, he had never touched a drug again. He had been a drug addict for decades. And now he, in fact, runs a retirement community for elderly people, where he uses experience to help them deal with their own death.
Out of curiosity, do you find that the life transformations are correlated to pleasurable NDEs, or do these even happen after a distressing NDE? Like people's lives are transformed for the better in some cases.
Interesting question. Again, because it's so hard to get people who have unpleasant NDEs to open up about them, but they do seem to have the same types of after effects, perhaps not as profoundly, because they're less likely to want to relive it for themselves. They tend to repress it. Whereas people who have pleasant experiences like to go back and remind themselves of it and enjoy the full fruits of it. But we haven't found anything about the near-death experience that correlates with the after effects.
Gotcha. Okay. What about, so this was something that you're mentioning in your new book, and you wanted to address, though sometimes there are negative after effects, right? Some people could be encouraged to commit suicide, for example, after having an do you want to maybe explain about those sort of negative after effects?
Well, there are some negative after effects in the sense that people's values and beliefs are usually quite transformed. And if their environment isn't similarly transformed, they have a hard time. For example, people who can't go back to the same career. If they were in a cutthroat business they can't go back to, or a violent profession like the military or the police. And sometimes it's just within their family. They have what's perceived by family members as a religious conversion, and the rest of the spouse may not. And they don't take lightly to the experiencer's wanting to change his or her lifestyle. Interestingly, as a psychiatrist, I expected them to become more suicidal because one of the most profound effects of a near-death experience is a decrease in the fear of death. And I know that fear of death often stops people from attempting suicide. But what I found in study after study, and other people have corroborated this, is that near-death experiences make people much less suicidal. And in fact, I've talked to a number of people who had been suicidal, who had made suicide attempts and had an NDE as a result of that attempt, and asked them to explain to me why they've changed. And what they say is that even though I've lost my fear of death, that also makes me lose my fear of living. I can live more fully now, take more risks, and enjoy life fuller because I'm not afraid of losing it. An example is of one fellow I saw who was a chronic pain patient in his mid-50s, who the doctors had basically given up on, and he was consigned to live a life of great pain, and finally decided that he couldn't take it anymore. He had been a devout Catholic and was stopped from attempting suicide by a fear of going to hell, but the pain got so great that he couldn't stand it anymore, and he did overdose. He then had a profound, beautiful near-death experience, and when I talked to him when he woke up the next day, he had no sign of suicidal thoughts. And what he said was, I realized in my NDE that life has meaning and purpose that I didn't appreciate before. And that now I see that all my suffering is there for a reason. It's not something to run away from. It's something to deal with and learn from. And he now actually enjoys all the things that we used to be called suffering for him.
All right, so one last quick follow-up for me before I turn it to Travis to ask his follow-up. But one thing that I keep hearing about is, OBEs, out-of-body experiences, or in some cases, I was lucky enough to work with Dale Allison, who's experienced that post-death communication. So how do NDEs relate to these types of phenomena, in your opinion?
Well, there are overlaps, and in fact, NDEs overlap with a lot of phenomena that can be called spiritual. The out-of-body experience is often one part of a near-death experience. Now, in the context of an NDE, it's usually a very pleasant experience. And I've talked to people who have had out-of-body experiences in other contexts where it was less pleasant. For example, people who have temporal lobe seizures sometimes have a sense of leaving their bodies. And that's usually a frightening experience for them, but not so for near-death experiencers. In terms of post-death communications, many near-death experiencers encounter what seem to be their spirits of deceased loved ones in their near-death experiences. And that is similar to the post-death communications that occur spontaneously. One difference is that the post-death communications often seem to relate to the experiencer as a passive recipient of the experience, whereas in the NDE, you're more of an active participant in the process.
All right, cool. Yeah, Travis, I'll turn it to you to kind of ask you had a follow-up for Bruce on this front. So yeah, take it away.
Yeah, one of the things that I found in doing some research for this was that younger survivors are more likely to experience an NDE and to have more intense experiences. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on why you think that might be.
Remember that we can't really study near-death experiences directly. What we can study is what people say to us about them and how their behavior changes. But that means that what we know is determined not only by what they experience, but what they're willing to share with us. It's true that younger people often have better memories than older people. Older people may have some brain damage or the diseases that interfere with their memory, or taking drugs that interfere with their memory. So you might expect younger people to remember more about what happens when they come close to death. And of course, younger people are more willing to share their unusual experiences with a stranger. Older people are much more conservative in general and less likely to share their strange experiences. And one reason for that is that I see in the hospital all the time, older patients who report their visions are often dismissed as having hallucinations, as being delirious or confused, and not taken seriously. Whereas a younger person is more likely to get a more positive reception and go on talking about the experience. So I'm not sure that younger people have more experiences, but we hear a lot more from them about their experiences.
Okay. So one of the sort of sub-features of an NDE is the case of veridical perception. So we'd appreciate it if, one, you could sort of explain what that is, and discuss any sort of evidence or anecdotes that would shed a little more light on that.
Sure. For those people who don't understand what a veridical perception is, that's kind of a technical term. What that means is a perception that is completely accurate. When people leave their bodies, they often describe what's going on around them as if they're seeing it from some out-of-body perspective. And if what they say is actually right and can be corroborated by other people, we call that veridical. For example, one person that I knew well was a 55-year-old man who was a truck driver, actually, and he had some sudden chest pain, was taken to the hospital, and had an emergency quadruple bypass operation. And in the middle of the operation, he claimed to have left his body and looked down and saw the operation going on, and he saw his surgeon flapping his arms as if he was trying to fly. Now, that didn't make sense to me. I've been in medicine for decades now at this point. I'd never seen or heard of anything like this. It's not something you see on TV shows about doctors. So I assumed this was a hallucination that the patient had. But he insisted he really saw it. And I said, well, did you talk to the doctor about it? And he said, yes. And the doctor got very angry when I mentioned it and just stalked out of the room. So with the patient's permission, I then went to talk to the surgeon and asked him about this. And the surgeon actually confirmed this. He said, I developed this habit, which I've never seen anyone else use. After I scrub in and have sterile gloves on, and I come into the operating room, I don't want to risk touching anything that's not sterile. So while I watch my assistants start the operation, I place my hands flat on my chest on my sterile gown and supervise them by pointing things out with my elbows instead of my fingers, so I won't touch anything. And he demonstrated wiggling his elbows around, which looked to me like someone trying to fly. So this is an example of the patient seeing something very unexpected that he possibly couldn't have guessed. And it turned out to be totally true. Actually, Jan Holden, another researcher, has studied about 100 cases of people who reported out-of-body perceptions. And in investigation, she found that more than 90% of them were completely accurate. Now, that's probably comparable to what our normal vision is. We're no more than 90% accurate. Another person I knew had an out-of-body experience during an operation, and she left her body and went out to the waiting room where she saw her mother smoking a cigarette, which totally startled her because her mother was not a smoker. I later interviewed the mother, and the mother acknowledged, yes, I was so anxious that I borrowed a cigarette from someone else and smoked it for the first time in my life. And I have many more examples like this in my book, After. Now, the way the skeptics often deal with this is just to say, well, it didn't happen. They just imagined it. And yet we have corroboration from other people. Now, if you were hit by a bus, no one can tell you it didn't happen. And that's the situation near-death experiences feel that they're in. This thing happened to them, and if people take it seriously, we have no explanation for it.
It was interesting in Janice Holden's chapter about this. she kind of phrased it as, well, we're most interested in apparently non-physical veridical perceptions, or AV.
Right.
Just sort of curious, do you have any examples of that where it's they have a veridical perception, but it's just something that is not possible to, on a physicalist level, for them to have that veridical perception? So, I know Gary Habermas has examples where they're observing things miles away from their location or something like that. So, yeah, do you have any like specific examples of AV?
Right. Well, the one I just mentioned about the woman who left her body during an operation and went up to the waiting room. I've got other examples. One woman, Anita Morjani, who's written a book about her experience called "Dying to Be Me." She had her experience in Hong Kong when she was dying from myeloma all over her body, and they had told her family that she was dying. So she had an out-of-body experience then, and went back to India, where her family was from, and saw her brother getting on a plane to come visit her. And of course, there's no way, she was totally unconscious for days at this time. There's no way she could have known about this, and yet it was accurate.
So obviously the skeptic will come back at this point, and they might say, well, a lot of these examples that you're giving, they're just anecdotal evidence, and that's unreliable. So how might you come back with that, issues with anecdotal evidence?
That's an interesting point, because we tend to trust evidence that comes from experiments, but there are some things you can't really do experiments on. For example, you can't randomly assign people to have a near-death experience or not, and then keep them blind as whether they did. Of course, they know it. But let me give you another example from another field in medicine. We all accept and believe that wearing a parachute when you jumped out of an airplane is going to be helpful to you. And we know this because we have lots of anecdotal observations of people who jumped or fell out of airplanes and died, and anecdotes about people who jumped out with parachutes and lived. And yet we have absolutely no evidence from controlled experiments to show that parachutes work, because no one's ever randomly assigned people to jump out with or without a parachute. So here we accept parachutes as being helpful without any evidence except for anecdotes. And I think there comes a point where you have to accept common sense rather than experiments.
On that front, though, there is, beyond the anecdotal evidence, there are systematic or controlled studies that have been attempted in that sort of thing. And it's been a while since I've been in the game, but at least as of 2009, my understanding is that there's been about 5 controlled studies.
That's right.
To see if these veridical perceptions take place or not. So, yeah, in the first place, do you want to just sort of, and the findings were that these all failed. They weren't able to have veridical perceptions based on these controlled studies. So, yeah, do you want to maybe first of all speak to those previous studies, and then maybe
Sure.
Yeah.
There have been about 5 of them, and I actually participated in 2 of them. And these are studies in which you place in a hospital room where you expect people to come close to dying, like an intensive care unit or a cardiac care unit. You place hidden targets, like up in the corners of the room, that can only be seen by looking down from the ceiling. And these are usually targets that no one knows about. We try not even to tell the hospital staff, so they don't mention it to the patient. And then when a patient has a near-death event and they report having a near-death experience, we ask them whether they saw anything unusual, hoping they will talk about the target. And when they don't mention it, we get more specific and eventually say, did you see anything up in the corner of the room? And at this point, as you mentioned, nobody has reported that. Now, this is not evidence that they didn't leave their bodies. It's evidence, there's no evidence that they that they saw it. They didn't report anything incorrect. They just failed to report it. Now, when I talk to patients about this, they laugh at me. They say, if I'm leaving my body and I'm out of my body for the first time in my life and I'm startled looking down, why am I going to look around the room for a target that I didn't know was there, that has no relevance to me, and then try to remember it and tell it to you? So I think the experiments were set up with a good intent, but were actually designed to fail, because there was no motivation on the part of the patients to participate in the studies.
And beyond these 5, so there hasn't been, in the last 10 or 15 years, there haven't been additional controlled studies that have been attempted since then?
They're actually very difficult studies to do because you need to study thousands of patients to find a handful that have actually claimed to leave their bodies. And as I mentioned, in the handful that have been done, I think in those 5 studies you mentioned, there were a total of 12 patients that could be found, and none of them expressed any reason to have gone to look for this target. So I think people decided it wasn't worth pursuing this. The odds of success were just so small. There's no point in investing the manpower required for it.
Hey, Bruce, if I could do a quick impromptu follow-up on that. Is there a relative location that is typically reported for when they're looking down on themselves? Are they always like directly above?
They're usually above, sometimes behind. None report looking up from the bottom, from underneath. But again, we always place the targets up high near the corner of the room, not particularly where the patient says he or she went. Part of that is because we want it to be unseen by the hospital staff.
Right.
I suppose you could place something right on the patient's face or chest, which would be more likely to be seen, but then everyone would know about it.
Okay, so if you were to design a new study based on this, what would you do differently to maybe try to get a better success rate?
I think the only way to increase the success rate would be to get the patient's cooperation beforehand, that if they left their body, they would look for this target that you were going to place somewhere in the room. And that kind of undermines part of the rationale for doing the studies. But that would probably increase your odds of getting somebody to look for the target.
What about like putting their name as the target, like just a big old sign that says John? You know, you think something like that might grab someone's attention?
Well, that would require you to put a new target up each time a patient had a cardiac arrest or a near-death event.
Right, yeah.
Okay, all right, cool. Yeah, I wanted to, good on you, Travis, for giving those follow-ups there. So, all right, perfect. Well, I think at this point, we come to the most important part, and that is explaining these phenomena. We understand what they are. We understand a little bit of specific types that might be relevant to what type of explanation might count in favor of that. And obviously my audience, a large portion of them are Christians or atheists, so that they're sort of wondering, well, how do we explain this stuff? Are there any naturalistic explanations that might be able to account for these types of data, or does it have to be supernatural or something like that? So,
well, again, let me go back to the fact that I started this research from a naturalistic, scientific and skeptical background, not expecting anything spiritual. I didn't even know what that meant, really. And so when I first started encountering near-death experiences, I was looking for the physical explanation for it. And over the years, many different explanations have been put forward. For example, that it's lack of oxygen to the brain, it's drugs given to dying patients, it's chemicals produced in the brain of dying patients, it's rogue electrical activity in the brain, it's our expectation of what's going to happen. And we have collected data testing all of those hypotheses, and the majority of the data has contradicted every single one of them. So although they make sense, they're plausible explanations, the data do not support them. One of the problems is that NDEs happen under a variety of physiological conditions. Sometimes the heart stops, sometimes the lung stops, sometimes there's brain damage. So it's not likely that there's going to be one mechanism that explains all of them.
One thing sort of out of curiosity about that, so in my one of my philosophy of emotions classes, the subject of NDEs got brought up, and they were talking about how in some cases there's no detectable brain activity or heart activity, and obviously this puts certain constraints on what kind of explanations might be at play, especially because people will report more vivid experience. The emotional centers of the brain wouldn't be active, but yet they're reporting intense emotion beyond even stuff that normal emotions or something like that. So yeah, I don't know. Do you think things like that, like the lack of EEG or EEG readings helps us speak to what types of explanations might be possible?
I think it does, Dale. I think all these explanations that have been proposed that involved the activity of the brain require a brain that's functioning. And in some NDEs, we have documentation that the brain was not functioning. Certainly, a lot of them occur in cardiac arrest, and we know that within a few seconds of the heart stopping, blood and fuel stops getting to the brain, and it no longer can function normally. And we have rare cases in which you have documentation of a flat EEG showing no electrical activity in the brain, when we have patients then reporting the most vivid experience of their lives. And that poses a problem for the neurochemical or neuroanatomical explanation of NDEs. It shouldn't happen when the brain is down, and yet it does. Actually, there have been some research in the last decade or so looking at psychedelic drug trips and looking at neuroimaging. We had expected that what these drugs do is stimulate the brain to become more active. And what the data are showing is that when you have these psychedelic drug trips, the more active the visions are, the psychedelic visions, the less activity there is in the brain. So this is another example where you have decreased brain activity permitting more vivid experiences.
Travis, did you have any follow-up on that? Or?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to ask, with the correlates between, lack of brain activity or cardiac arrest or whatever and the experience, how do you establish a temporal relation that says that that experience actually occurred during that physiological state?
That's a great question, Travis, because often the objection of materialists is that these patients made up the near-death experience after they revived and then retroactively attributed it to the time when they were unconscious. But in fact, what we see in a number of near-death experiences is that people have what we call time anchors. They see things and report things that occurred at a specific point in time when we know they were unconscious. For example, the patient that I mentioned before who saw his doctor flapping his arms as if to fly. I asked him what else was going on at that time so we could sort of anchor it, and he reported seeing the other doctors, the assistants, cutting open his leg, which totally surprised him because he had no idea why they would be working on his leg if they were supposed to be correcting his heart problem. And what they were doing, in fact, was taking a vein out of his leg to create an artificial new vein around his heart. So we know exactly when he had this vision of the doctor flapping his arms because we know at one point in the surgery, they were cutting open his leg. And we have many examples like this. I described many more in my book after, where we have people reporting things that happened at a specific time during their unconscious period. So we know exactly when they were having the near-death experience.
And how often does that time anchor point specifically to a point in time where their heart is stopped or their EEG is flat or something like that?
Not very often, unfortunately. People often report things that we can't locate in time. But there are some that we can. For example, Eben Alexander, who had a coma that lasted 8 days from a severe bacterial infection of his brain, reported at one point seeing specific people standing around his bed, basically having a prayer circle around his bed. And of course, he was in the ICU at this time, and often in this hospital, I know, people who are not direct relatives of the patient are not allowed in the intensive care unit. And yet he described who they were and where they were standing. And we know exactly who was there on what days. There's only one day when it happened. And we have medical records showing that his brain was completely non-functional on that particular day when he reported accurately who was standing around his bed.
All right. Yeah, and I think Travis also asked as a follow-up. He wanted to get sort of your view on, in the first place, what does the data present as the greatest challenge to the materialist or naturalist interpretation? We've kind of been hinting at some of that, but also conversely, something that's not necessarily always asked you. what data presents the greatest challenge to transcendent interpretation?
Yeah, so those are tricky questions. The greatest challenge to materialism, I think, comes from something we mentioned before, of how a brain that is damaged or not functioning can produce the most vivid experience of someone's life. And of course, there are other specific things like how can a material explanation deal with how people can see things accurately from an out-of-body perspective. Let me give you another example. We have often examples of near-death experiencers who encounter people in their NDE who are deceased, but who were not known to have died. For example, one fellow I knew was a 26-year-old engineer who had severe pneumonia and was in respiratory arrest. And he had come to know one of the nurses very well because she was about his age, and he was trying to flirt with her when he was more healthy. And she had told him the day before this that she was going to be away for a few days because it was her 21st birthday and her parents were coming to celebrate with her. After she left, he had his near-death experience. And in his NDE, he met this nurse. And he asked her, what was she doing there? And she said, I need you to go back and tell my parents that I'm very sorry I wrecked the red MGB. And you have to go back now and talk to them. When he later awoke, told the first nurse he saw about this vision, and she ran from the room crying. It turned out that this nurse had been given a red MGB by her parents, for her birthday, and immediately drove off on it excitedly, crashed the car, and died immediately. And there's no way he could have known that she was dead or how she died. No way a material explanation can explain this. Now, you also asked, Dale, about the challenge to transcendental explanations, because most of these seem to be better explained by the fact that we have some spiritual or immaterial mind or spirit that can function without the brain being active. And yet when they come back into their bodies, they're talking to us using their brain and their bodies. And I think the biggest challenge to transcendental explanations is to explain how this immaterial something, whether it's mind or spirit or soul, can interact with the physical brain and body. And we have no explanation for that either. So both the material and transcendent explanations have huge gaps that we can't explain at this point.
Out of curiosity, one of my audience, when I mentioned you were coming on the show, they're very excited and that sort of thing. They like the NDE evidence, but they're sort of quoting Pim van Lommel and saying, well, actually, this in terms of transcendent views, NDEs are better associated with philosophical idealism rather than some kind of dualist notion. I know you, like, what do you think about something like that? Do NDEs allow us to specify certain transcendent views as better than others, or?
I really can't go there.
No problem. Yeah, no worries.
I'll tell you, in writing my book after, I relied on the research of the few people who have studied NDEs, but there's obviously a great deal we don't know about them at this point. And one huge area that I can't really address adequately is the philosophy of it. I was brought up, as I said, in a scientific household. I deal with physical evidence, with data, and when I can't explain the data, I look for new explanations. And I've come reluctantly to the idea that we do have some immaterial part of us, a spiritual side, if you will. Now, the idealist would say that's all there is. There is no physical side as well. And I have not been ready to go there yet. I still feel so much locked in my body. I have a hard time denying that the body is independently real of itself. But this is just my personal bias. And we don't have evidence anyway to support either a dualist or a idealist position.
It looks like we might have a little time since we're getting close to the last question. I have a few other follow-ups on this thread. There several things came to mind as I started thinking about, how does the naturalist explanation fit with other research programs? And I'm just going to list a bunch of this stuff, and if you can just kind of pick and choose how you want to see the intersection with those research programs. So the things that came to mind were like memory research, and particularly the notion of reconstructive memory versus recollection memory. And then you've got research on self-perception and sensory integration, like you have with Ramachandran, where they're sort of inducing out-of-body experiences. And then you've got research on sleep and dreams and the stuff that's, happening when we're conscious but not conscious. So do you have any thoughts on the intersection with that kind of research?
Sure. Most of the memory research suggests that our memory is not perfect. And in fact, there are some things that make our memory even more faulty, which happen in near-death experiences, in near-death events rather. For example, there are traumatic experiences. That makes memory more faulty. There are strongly emotional experiences. They happen in times of decreased brain function. Those things all should make the memory less reliable. However, since I've been doing this research for so many decades now, I've been able to go back to people that I interviewed 30, 40 years ago and interview them again and ask them to report to me exactly what happened. And what I have found is that there is absolutely no change in their memories over the decades. So unlike other memories of NDEs do not seem to fade over time. In terms of the self-perception and integration, these all rely on finding the right place in the brain where these things happen. And as I said before, when you have a brain that's not functioning, those explanations aren't very helpful. These researchers who induce out-of-body experiences by stimulating parts of the brain, usually the right temporal lobe, are not actually inducing out-of-body experiences. They're inducing illusions that are similar to out-of-body experiences, but actually are very different. In the spontaneous out-of-body experience, such as in an NDE, the person perceives themselves as existing out of there and looking down on their physical bodies. And they can move around and think and feel from that out-of-body perspective. In the out-of-body experiences, quotes, that are induced by electrical stimulation, the research participant experiences himself as being in the body and seeing the external body outside, which doesn't move around, is not an active participant. It's not at all the same thing. Also, in these induced experiences, you never hear a report of an accurate perception from an out-of-body perspective, which is common in a near-death experience. So I think these lines of research certainly give us suggestions about where to look to explain NDEs, but they by no means give us explanations.
How about sleep and dreams? I've seen some studies that talk about interruption of REM sleep
Sure.
can have experiences that are similar to what you get with an NDE.
That again is misleading. People have shown that near-death experiencers tend to report more symptoms of REM sleep deprivation than other people do. But when you look at it, what those symptoms are common NDE features, like having visions. Furthermore, when you look better at the data, the population data of these REM symptoms, we find that those symptoms are appearing in the general population just as frequently as in the near-death experiencers. So they don't actually occur more common in NDEers. We've done some research looking at the dreamlike quality of NDEs, how dreamlike or how realistic it is. And invariably, these studies show that NDEs are reported as more vivid than normal waking perception, just as normal waking perception is more vivid than dreams. So near-death experiencers say there's no comparison between dreams and the NDE. They're totally different experiences.
Have you looked specifically at lucid dreaming?
I have not. I know there's extensive research on lucid dreaming, but I don't know if there's much connection between that and the near-death experience.
Okay. I was just asking because that would have that same quality of seeming more real, right?
Right.
I've got one more follow-up, if that's okay.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, sure. So, I was in doing some research. I looked at the 2010 article that you wrote called "Implications of Near-Death Experiences for Post-Materialist Psychology," and one of the quotes in there was that the conflict between a materialist model of brain-mind identity and the occurrence of NDEs under conditions of general anesthesia and cardiac arrest is profound and inescapable. So, I'm wondering if given the relative immaturity of neuroscience and consciousness research, do you see that conflict is entirely insurmountable, or do you think that's merely a problem given the current state of affairs?
That's a great philosophical question. It is not a scientific question. Saying that materialism may someday find a way to explain NDEs is not a scientific hypothesis, because there's no way to possibly test it. You can always say, well, that someday hasn't come yet. It's no more scientific than saying that NDEs are a gift from God. There's just no way to test that. So saying that materialism may someday find a way to explain it is a philosophical position that is not a scientific position.
Right. So when in that quote, when you talk about the conflict being profound and inescapable, what do you mean by profound and inescapable? I guess is a better way to phrase the question.
In terms of the materialistic understanding we have now, you have in NDEs things that should not be possible if the mind is based solely in the brain. We have situations where the brain is not functioning or functioning very poorly, and the mind seems to be functioning better than ever. And that is what I meant by being a profound and inescapable contradiction.
All right, cool. Yeah, thank you for that, Travis. Excellent questions and that sort of thing. So that's why I brought you on board. So, all right, cool. So we've got about 5 minutes left. So Bruce, I just want to ask the last question to you. This was one that you requested, so it's one that I know you'll enjoy. So in the first place, what do NDEs mean for those of us who haven't experienced them? And then maybe incorporate into your answer, tell us a little bit about your forthcoming book and what exactly you think NDEs reveal to us for people that haven't experienced anything like that.
Save the most important question for last, and that's basically, what do NDEs mean for your listeners? In writing my book, After, I relied on my own research and that of a few other people who have studied NDEs. And there's a great deal we don't yet know about near-death experiences. But what I described in my book, and what I hope I can tell you now briefly, is that the most important thing about NDEs is that they have profound effects on people's attitudes, values, and beliefs. And this is not only true of the experiencer, who we would expect to be changed, but the people who learn about them as well. There have been several studies of student populations who are taught about NDEs in nursing schools, in medical schools, in colleges, and actually one study in high school, where students have been taught about NDEs, and then in follow-up a year or two later, they still remain profoundly changed in their sense of compassion and spirituality. I know that I personally have been tremendously changed by studying NDEs. Starting out as a strict materialist, I've come to appreciate the spiritual side of us. I myself have become much less fearful, more open to the unknown, which does not make me more gullible. It makes me more invested in pursuing the answers. And it's made me much more spiritual, in the sense of feeling interconnected with other people and with the world around me. I think this is particularly important now in times of this incredible pandemic we're going through, which has amplified our normal concerns about life and death and what it's all about. And what NDEs, I think, reveal about life is that these experiences with our spiritual side are common experiences, and they're normal experiences. They're not a sign of mental illness, and they are life-changing. They reduce our fear of death. They suggest that our minds are different from our brains, and therefore we don't necessarily have to stop thinking and feeling when our bodies die. And that changes how we think about death and dying. Now, you also asked about, what does that mean about beyond, the beyond? And I can't really give you a good answer to that. The afterlife, most people who have NDEs say that what they experienced can't be put into words. And then we say, oh, great, tell me all about it. So of course, we're forcing them to distort the experience by putting words to it. And they resort to using whatever cultural metaphors they have at their disposal, which often tend to be religious, but they acknowledge when they're doing this that they're using metaphors. So I don't take them at face value. So I can't really say what the afterlife is like. What I can say is that I've been convinced by this research that death is not an ending, but it's a transition to something else.
Yeah, thank you so much to both Bruce and Travis for coming on. I hope both of you guys enjoyed the interview there.
Well, thank you, Dale.
Thanks for having me on. I guess we should probably give Bruce a chance, though, to say a little more about the book and dates and that kind of stuff.
Sure. The full title of the book is After. A Doctor Explores What Near-Death Experiences Reveal About Life and Beyond. It's being published by St. Martin's Press on March 2nd, 2021, but it is available now for pre-ordering. You can learn more about it on my website, which is brucegreyson.com. That's BRUCEGREYSON.com. And there are descriptions of the book, of some of my other work, how to pre-order the book, some videos of other lectures I've given about the work, and information about near-death experiences in general.
All right. Well, yeah, as I said, thank you guys. And yeah, I guess have a great week. For the audience, just so they know what I have coming up next time. I've got a couple, we're debating the Shroud of Turin. And I'm bringing on a couple of pro-shroud experts, Joe Marino and Bob Rucker. Joe has got a new book out on the carbon-14 and responding to that. So look out for that coming up next week. And yeah, other than that, have a great week, everybody, and take care, Travis and Bruce.
Thank you, Dale.